"Don't come and kiss me, I already know everything about your lover," I shouted, my voice choked with pain and disbelief, while she, motionless in front of me, seemed not to understand that, at that moment, our whole world was collapsing. She just smiled, a nervous smile, and replied, almost defiantly, "Tell me then what you know about this supposed lover that you're making up." I didn't hesitate. I took out of my pocket the photo I had received hours before, a single image capable of destroying decades of history, and placed it before his eyes. The silence that followed was the cruelest of all sounds I have ever heard. Her mouth opened for an answer, but no words found their way out. It was as if, in that moment, she had finally understood the gravity of what she had done. And I felt my blood boiling under my skin, my heart beating uncontrollably, crushed under the weight of a reality that I never wanted to see. For a long time, I was blind. Blinded by love, by trust, by that cowardly illusion that makes us believe that the person we love would never be able to stick a dagger in our back. All the small changes in behavior, all the lame excuses that I accepted with a tired smile, were now revealed in their true form, obvious signs that I insisted on ignoring. The nights when she arrived late, the smell of a strange perfume that wasn't hers, the cell phone locked with a password, the smiles she offered to invisible messages, everything was there, drawn in front of me all the time, but I chose to trust. I preferred to love. And it was this love that turned me into the fool I now found myself faced with the most bitter betrayal. She still tried to speak, justify herself, invent some pathetic story that could minimize the impact of that photo. "It was just one night," I stammered, as if that would erase the bitter taste of humiliation I felt. As if a single night of infidelity could be treated as a silly mistake, an irrelevant slip-up. I laughed, a dry, bitter laugh, as I watched her plead with her eyes, trying to hold on to any crumb of hope that might still remain. But there was nothing left. Nothing but rubble and broken promises. For days, the image of the two of them leaving that party together haunted my mind like a cruel ghost. I wondered at what moment exactly she decided I was no longer enough. That our memories, our dreams, our history together, weren't worth more than a few hours of cheap excitement next to another man. At which point love became an obligation and commitment became a prison from which she needed to escape. And each answer my mind fabricated was worse than the last. I spent sleepless nights, listening to the echo of my own breathing, while the house, the same house we built together, every wall permeated with our laughter, our arguments, our tender moments, seemed to have become a cemetery for everything I believed to be eternal. She walked through the rooms like a stranger, and I, petrified, watched the pathetic spectacle of our ruin. There was a moment, amidst the chaos, when she tried to redeem herself. He tried to get closer with promises of change, fake tears and cold kisses that no longer reached me. "I made a mistake, but I love you," he said. As if love was enough to patch up what was irreparably destroyed. As if the simple confession of love could erase the taste of betrayal that she planted inside me. I looked at her and saw a person I no longer recognized, a woman who had torn up our story for an ephemeral pleasure. And I knew, with painful clarity, that I could never trust her again. The worst, however, was yet to come. Because life, capricious and relentless, decided to surprise me in the cruelest way possible. When she finally understood that there would be no forgiveness, that there was no return, that I was no longer the same man willing to blindly forgive everything in the name of love, she tried to cling to me with desperation. But at that moment, I was no longer alone. Without her knowing, the void she left was filled by someone who didn't carry the weight of lies in her eyes, someone who looked at me as if I were still worthy of being loved without reservations, without betrayals. The irony, sweet and bitter, is that while she was begging to return to the home she herself had destroyed, I had already found a new path, a new story, a new chance to be happy. When she fell to her knees before me, crying belated tears and offering empty promises, I just watched her in silence, carrying within me the cold serenity of someone who no longer had anything to lose. The time when her tears would have moved me had passed. The only thing that remained was the distant echo of what we once were and the bitter certainty of what we would never be again. The cruelest thing of all was seeing her finally understand that she had lost not only the man who loved her unconditionally, but also the opportunity to be happy by my side. That her punishment would not be imposed by me, but by the life she had chosen, by the emptiness that now consumed her, by the loneliness that neither her lover nor lame excuses would be able to fill. And while she wallowed in her own regret, I walked toward a new beginning. A beginning where the scars of betrayal still hurt, yes, but where there was also hope, true love and, above all, respect. And if she imagined that she would have another chance, that she could regain what she destroyed, little did she know that destiny had in store for her the bitterest of ironies. She would be forced to watch from afar, helpless, while I, the man she thought was disposable, learned to be happy again, with someone who would never make me an option. Perhaps what destroyed her most was knowing that it didn't matter how many tears she shed, how many times she humiliated herself, or how many beautiful words she tried to say. Because the truth was simple and brutal, I no longer belonged to his story. I was now the chapter she could never rewrite. And somewhere between the pain, betrayal and rebirth, a question whispered, restlessly, in the back of my mind, if everything we experienced was so true, how could she betray me so easily? Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support or romanticize betrayal under any circumstances. All the stories you hear are fictional, created to show, with intensity and realism, how betrayal can destroy lives, loves and families. Get ready to dive into a shocking story that will stir your emotions and make you reflect on the choices that shape a destiny. Good story. Noah and Isabel were one of those couples that, to anyone looking from the outside, seemed to have been designed by destiny itself. They met when they were young, in a busy cafe, amidst shy laughter and looks that conveyed silent promises. He, a man with a restless spirit but a serene heart, carried in his smile the hope of someone who believed in love as a transformative force. She, with her delicate gestures and careful words, seemed to float through the world with a lightness that immediately captivated him. From their first meeting, there was a connection between them that transcended logic, as if their souls recognized each other from other lives, as if their previous stories had only been rehearsals for that moment. They built a life together in a house with a light facade, surrounded by trees whose leaves rustled in the spring mornings. Noah liked to sit on the porch on warm afternoons, watching Isabel tend the small garden that she herself so lovingly cultivated. The flowers, colorful and vibrant, seemed to be the perfect representation of what their days were like, full of color, life, and tenderness. Sundays were reserved for walks in the city park, where they lost themselves in conversations about future dreams, projects for two, trips they hadn't yet taken, but which already lived in their hearts as certainties. Noah worked as an architect and dedicated himself with passion to transforming the ideas that emerged from the minds of his clients into reality, but his greatest pleasure was designing small details in the home, to surprise Isabel. A bookshelf for her books, a covered porch so they could watch the summer rains, a hammock swing where she could read the stories she loved so much. He saw her every smile as a prize, a confirmation that every effort was worth it. Isabel, in turn, was a literature teacher at a local school, and saw in Noah's eyes the serenity of a man who knew how to love deeply, without rushing, without demands. Their friends often commented on how in sync they looked, as if they understood each other with just a glance. At parties, it was common to see them dancing together, oblivious to the world around them, as if the music existed just for them. The complicity between the two was palpable, an invisible thread that united them even in moments of silence. Isabel said, laughing, that she loved the way Noah hugged her, as if he wanted to protect her not only from the cold, but also from the worries of the world. Noah, in his heart, believed that she was his north, the compass that gave meaning to his days. However, as happens in all human history, time began to leave its subtle marks on the relationship. Professional commitments, accumulated fatigue, small disagreements began to seep through the cracks that neither of them wanted to see. Nights that used to be filled with endless conversations became filled with silent tiredness. Dreamed trips were successively postponed, replaced by meetings, deadlines, and unpostponable commitments. And yet, there was love. There was affection, there was respect. At least that was what Noah firmly believed, even when he felt something slipping through his fingers, like fine sand that was impossible to retain. Isabel, in turn, felt torn between the routine that consumed her and the latent need to find within herself the vibrant woman she believed she had once been. The walls of the house, which before seemed to embrace her, now began to seem narrow, limiting, as if asking her to breathe other airs, even if she didn't know exactly which ones. Still, she loved Noah. I loved the way he worried about her pain, how he noticed her contained tears, how he insisted on preparing tea for her on days when sadness, although silent, was present. Commemorative dates were sacred moments for them. On their wedding anniversary, Noah always prepared something special, a candle at dinner, a letter written in his own hand, a gesture that said more than any gift could. Isabel smiled, moved, every time she received these demonstrations of love, but inside she began to feel an uneasiness that she couldn't name. As if, despite all the care and dedication, something was missing that she herself couldn't explain. Noah didn't understand. Or maybe, deep down, I understood, but preferred to believe it was just a phase. That all that was needed was more patience, more love, more attention. That the time that brought them together with such strength would also be capable of healing any wound, even if invisible. He believed in the little things, in lazy Sunday mornings, in movies watched cuddled up on the couch, on improvised sidewalks. Every gesture, no matter how small, was, for him, a reaffirmation that, despite everything, they were still on the same path, still walking side by side. And it was precisely in this scenario of calm love, but permeated by silent fissures, that a sequence of events began to slowly change the dynamics between them. Small absences began to be justified with a strange rush. Unexpected commitments, out-of-schedule meetings, quick trips. Isabel seemed more distracted, more distant. Noah, always willing to trust, attributed it all to the stress of work, the pressure of adulthood that so often took a silent toll on the dreams of yesteryear. Some nights, upon returning home, Noah found Isabel already asleep on the couch, with books scattered around her, as if she was trying to escape to other worlds, other lives, through words. He carefully covered her with a blanket, kissed her forehead and felt a tightness in his chest that he couldn't name. Something in him told her to back away, but he refused to give in to that uncomfortable voice. It was easier to believe in the love they built, the history they shared, the plans not yet realized. Looking from the outside, it was impossible to notice any cracks. The couple who walked hand in hand in the park was the same one who smiled in photos on social media, who was seen at dinners, at friend meetings, at school events. But inside the house, inside Noah's chest, something had changed. Something that still didn't have a face, but was already starting to leave its marks, invisible to anyone who didn't want to see. And Noah, moved by hope, insisted on not seeing. Life continued to follow its course, with its ups and downs, its routines and small joys. They still laughed together, still shared confidences, still said, "I love you," on busy mornings. But there was, between the words and the gestures, a new space, an empty space that slowly grew, consuming what was once solid, transforming what was previously certain into doubt. Noah felt it, but remained silent. Isabel felt it, but she was lost in her own concerns. And so, day after day, stone upon stone, they built an invisible wall between them, without realizing that, instead of building bridges, they were moving away. A subtle, painful separation that disguised itself as routine, that was hidden behind automatic smiles and hurried kisses. The love still existed, but it seemed suffocated by unspoken absences, by postponed conversations, by unconfessed desires. Noah continued to believe that everything was temporary. That the storm would soon pass and they would return to being that couple that seemed indestructible. That the dreams they planted together would blossom once again, with more strength, more color, more life. He believed in Isabel, he believed in everything they built together. And it was this unshakable faith that prevented him from seeing that, while he held her hand tightly, she was already beginning to let go, step by step, in silence. And without him realizing it, without him being able to imagine it, life, merciless in its ironies, was preparing for Noah a twist capable of tearing away every piece of his confidence, his faith in love, his hope in the future. A revelation that would arrive like a hurricane, destroying not only the walls of the house they built, but also the foundations of what Noah believed to be eternal. What Noah didn't yet know was that life was about to teach him the hardest lesson, that sometimes even the purest loves are betrayed by the cruelest choices. And that, in the end, the most difficult thing would not be dealing with the loss, but accepting that the person he loved had already chosen to leave, even when he still claimed to be by his side. The routine that Noah and Isabel shared, once full of silent promises, gradually became a cold sequence of automatic gestures and looks that no longer met each other with the same certainty as before. Her absence began to take its toll on moments that were previously natural, such as hurried breakfasts, Saturday lunches filled with laughter and nights when bodies searched for each other in the dark without the need for words. Now, the space between them seemed untouchable, an invisible barrier built with small silences, murmured apologies and unpostponable commitments that appeared as increasingly frequent specters in her life. Noah, enveloped by the foolish hope that everything would be right, tried to cling to any vestige of normality, forcing smiles, preparing dinners that ended on cold, empty tables, sending affectionate messages that only received hurried, devoid of warmth in response. Isabel, once so full of life by his side, was now a shadow of herself, as if her thoughts were always wandering to places Noah no longer had access to. It was evident, in her gestures and words, that she no longer fully belonged to that life they had built with so much effort. And yet, he refused to see clearly. The love he felt for her was a blindfold over his eyes, an anchor that kept him tied to a hope that day after day disintegrated a little more. Sleepless nights became frequent, thoughts spinning in circles, questioning where she had failed, at what point had she stopped being enough for her. And every time he searched for an answer, all he found was the anguish of the unknown, a feeling of inadequacy that gnawed at his insides in silence. It was on an ordinary night, when the city was already sleeping under the heavy blanket of dawn, that Noah finally realized that something more serious was hanging over them. Isabel had left for a work meeting that lasted for hours, without plausible justifications, without responses to calls or messages. He, sitting on the sofa in the living room, stared at the dark screen of his cell phone, fighting the urge to go look for her, to demand an explanation that, deep down, he feared hearing. The hours dragged on like open wounds until, around 3 a.m, the door opened with an almost imperceptible creak and she entered. Her eyes avoided his. The disheveled clothes, the unfamiliar perfume that hung in the air like a silent confession, the nervous way she threw her bag on the table. Everything about her screamed a truth he didn't want to face. Noah stood up slowly, as if each muscle weighed a ton, and approached her with forced calm, just asking if everything was okay. Isabel murmured yes, that it was just a complicated job that had gone on longer than expected, and tried to smile, a fragile, broken smile that didn't reach her eyes. He watched her in silence, feeling his stomach turn, his heart beating in a strange rhythm, as if his own body was denouncing what his mind was still reluctant to accept. That night, lying next to her in bed, listening to her rhythmic breathing as if nothing had changed, Noah understood that something had been broken between them, in a way that could no longer be repaired. In the following days, the distance between them became even more brutal. Isabel always seemed to be somewhere else, even when she was there, in front of him. Words became scarce, kisses mechanical, hugs became rare until they disappeared completely. Noah tried to deceive himself, he tried to find excuses for the coldness, for the empty looks, for the absences that accumulated like unpaid debts in his chest. Until, one Saturday afternoon, when looking through the forgotten message box in the shared email they used for domestic matters, Noah found a piece of mail that wasn't addressed to him. An invitation. A party. The sender's name, unknown. The response signature, familiar. His breathing hitched for a moment. Everything inside him screamed that it was better to stop there, close the box, pretend he hadn't seen anything. But some greater force, an almost desperate need to understand, made him continue. The messages exchanged were few, but enough to raise the suspicion that he had been trying to bury for weeks. Discrete plans, schedule combinations, subtly affectionate words. Each line read was like a slow, cruel stab. The ground seemed to slip away from beneath his feet and, for the first time, Noah felt a dull hatred grow within him, mixed with disgust, disappointment, and the searing pain of realization. It was no longer a doubt. It was a fact. Isabel had someone. And, at that moment, all the certainties that supported him collapsed in a silent explosion. Noah, however, didn't confront it. Not at that time. He preferred to observe. Acting as if he knew nothing, as if he were still the same naive and hopeful man. He began to notice details that had previously escaped him, the departures justified for fragile reasons, the impatience in the face of his attempts to approach, the hidden messages, the strange glow in her eyes when receiving notifications that she never shared. It was like watching your own life fall apart in slow motion, powerless to stop it, condemned to just watch. He determined to obtain definitive proof, not because he still had hopes of saving her, but because he needed to confront her with the truth that she insisted on denying. He prepared himself with the cold precision of someone who knows that their heart will be torn apart, but who, even so, needs to see it with their own eyes. And so, one night, he discreetly followed Isabel. He watched her enter a restaurant they had never been to together, smiling. He watched her meet a man who wasn't him. He watched the two exchange knowing looks, subtle touches, smiles he hadn't seen in a long time. With every gesture he saw, something died inside him. It wasn't just love that died, it was trust, faith, hope. Every step she took next to another man was a blow that ripped apart what little was left of the story they built together. When he saw them leaving the restaurant together, hugging each other, laughing like two teenagers having their first crush, Noah felt that the world around him stopped making sense. He took a photo, not out of revenge, but because he needed to materialize the pain. He needed something concrete so he wouldn't go crazy trying to convince himself that it was all just a nightmare. That same night, returning home, he sat in the dark of the living room, the photo in his hands, feeling the weight of each shared memory slowly crush him. Isabel arrived a few hours later, full of apologies, smelling of strange perfume, talking about a meeting that had run long. Noah didn't say anything. He just looked at her with a blank look, emptied of everything that was once love. She smiled nervously, tried to kiss him as if nothing had happened. And it was then that his voice, full of pain that was unrecognizable even to himself, broke the silence. "Don't come and kiss me. I already know everything about your lover." The impact of those words was immediate. Isabel recoiled as if she had been hit. He tried to hide it, he tried to laugh, he tried to invent some lie to maintain control of the situation. But Noah didn't allow it. Without hesitation, he placed the photo in front of her. The silence that followed was more devastating than any scream, any accusation. Because, at that moment, the mask fell. And what remained between them was just emptiness. Still, as devastating as the discovery of the betrayal was, Noah could barely imagine that what was to come would be infinitely more painful. Because the betrayal was just the tip of the iceberg, the beginning of an even crueler truth, a secret hidden so skillfully that not even his heart suspected. And, as Noah stared into Isabel's empty eyes, as the weight of betrayal fell upon him like an irreversible sentence, deep down, something whispered that the worst was yet to be revealed. Noah remained still, holding the weight of that image frozen on paper as if it were the very evidence of his emotional bankruptcy. Isabel, in front of him, was still desperately searching for words that could untie the knot she herself had created, but no lie, no apology, no tears shed out of guilt would be enough to change what was there, printed with brutal clarity. She tried to explain herself, saying that she didn't know how it had happened, that things between them were difficult, that work consumed her, that she felt alone, suffocated, lost within herself. Noah listened, without really listening, like someone watching an accident in slow motion, without being able to intervene, just absorbing every detail of the destruction that was already inevitable. His eyes, cold, didn't blink, his mouth remained closed in a rigid line, as if speaking would give voice to the pain he fought to keep contained. Isabel knelt on the living room floor, a gesture that would have been devastating before, but now seemed like just another piece of poorly rehearsed theater. Her tears with the carpet and her hands shook as she said between sobs that she still loved him, that it was all a mistake, a momentary confusion, something she desperately wanted to erase. Noah crouched down in front of her, looking at her closely, as if searching her eyes for some shred of truth, some spark of genuine regret. And it was then that, with an almost frightening calm, he asked, "Why?" The question hung in the air like a slow poison, seeping into every corner of the room, permeating everything around it with an oppressive sense of finality. Isabel hesitated, lowered her eyes, ran her hand through her hair in desperation. She tried to mumble some excuse, but Noah, impassive, just continued to stare at her, demanding an answer that went beyond the empty phrases she insisted on repeating. Finally, after a drawn-out silence, she whispered something barely audible, something that made the ground beneath Noah's feet disappear. She said that, deep down, she had never stopped feeling insufficient, that she had spent years with him trying to be the perfect woman, the perfect wife, the ideal partner, and that one day, without even realizing it, she began to lose herself in her own frustrated expectations. She said the other man made her feel alive in a way she no longer knew was possible. But deep down, even as he spoke, his eyes betrayed an even uglier, even more cutting truth, a truth that Noah, instinctively, knew hadn't yet been spoken. The conversation dragged on into the early hours of the morning, between stifled accusations and pathetic attempts to patch up something that was already beyond repair. Noah, exhausted from so much pain, asked her to leave the house for a few days. She needed space, she needed to understand how to rise from the rubble she had transformed her life into. Isabel left in silence, taking with her only a small suitcase and the shadow of what they once were. The house, without her, seemed strangely bigger, colder, emptier, but at the same time, Noah felt a pang of relief in the middle of his chest, as if he could finally breathe without the weight of the lie hanging in the air. Over the next few days, Noah tried to piece together what was left of him. He found support in friends, in family, in small gestures that, although unable to erase the pain, served as reminders that he still existed beyond what Isabel had destroyed. And it was precisely in one of these moments of attempted reconstruction that the improbable happened. You met someone. Not in a planned way, not as a desperate escape from loneliness, but in an organic, almost natural way, like the first spring breeze after a winter that was too long. It was a coworker, someone who had always been there, but who, in the rush of days, he had never really noticed. And now, with his heart in ruins and his soul hungry for something true, Noah saw in her a light he thought he had lost forever. The conversation started unpretentious, evolved into laughter, into confidences, into looks that warmed parts of his being that Noah believed were dormant. Without realizing it, he found pieces of himself in the smiles she offered him, in the way she was genuinely interested in his story, how she saw value in him without needing promises or heroism. It was different, it was light, it was real. It was living proof that love, when true, does not require painful sacrifices to exist. And when Isabel, regretful and desperate, tried to return, she found a different man from the one she had left behind. Noah was no longer the same. And, cruelly, she realized that there was no longer a place for her in his life. Isabel's insistence became suffocating, her attempts at reconciliation bordered on despair. She sent long messages during the early hours of the morning, showed up unannounced in places she knew he frequented, tried to appealingly remember the good times they shared. But it was too late. Noah, although he still felt a dull ache for the ruins she had left, had already begun to rebuild his foundations on more solid foundations. And that was exactly what destroyed her, knowing that he was moving on, that his place had been taken not just in physical space, but, more painfully, in emotional space. The final revelation came on a rainy night, when Isabel, unable to contain her need to speak, asked for one more chance to be heard. Noah, with resigned compassion, agreed to meet her for the last time. They sat facing each other, like two strangers trying to decipher the remnants of a shared history. And it was in that meeting that Isabel, between tears and sobs, revealed what Noah could never have anticipated. The other man, the lover who had destroyed her marriage, was not just any adventure, he was not just the result of need or momentary passion. It was someone Noah knew. Someone who frequented the same circle of friends. A longtime colleague, someone he considered a brother, a friend who had shared dreams, confidences, hopes with him. Isabel confessed, with a broken voice and a face covered in shame, that their involvement had begun innocently, with trivial conversations that evolved into casual encounters, which became intimate without her having the strength, or desire, to stop it. He said that, deep down, being someone so close to Noah made everything more exciting, more forbidden, more intoxicating. Noah felt the world spin beneath his feet. It wasn't just her betrayal that weighed heavily now, but the betrayal of a friendship he thought was unshakable. Every memory of shared laughter, of exchanged advice, of support in difficult times, now seemed poisoned, corroded by lies and betrayal. Isabel continued speaking, but her words became indistinct to him, like background noise. All Noah could feel was an overwhelming emptiness, a mixture of anger and sadness so deep it seemed incapable of being expressed in words. He got up without saying anything, leaving her behind, lost in his own belated regret. He left in the cold rain, without a clear direction, just walking as if he needed to put distance between himself and the pain that threatened to swallow him. Because now he knew that it wasn't just love that she had betrayed. Aside from trust. Aside from loyalty. It was everything that made life, despite its difficulties, still seem worth it. And as he walked, wet to the bone, feeling no cold, feeling nothing but a bitter numbness, Noah knew that even though he was broken into 1,000 pieces, he would never allow the past to define him. Because even in the biggest losses, even in the worst blows, there is the silent opportunity for rebirth. And Noah's true rebirth was just beginning. The light rain was still falling when Noah stopped walking, finding shelter under the awning of a small cafe that was already closed. The faint lights reflected in the puddles formed on the asphalt, distorting reality as in an impressionist painting, and he remained there, motionless, trying to reorganize his own thoughts that insisted on intertwining in a suffocating tangle of hurt, anger and disbelief. The world seemed distant, almost unreal, as if he had been ripped out of his own life and thrown into a nightmare from which he couldn't wake up. Everything he knew, all the people he trusted, everything he believed to be unshakable, had been destroyed with the coldness of a blade thrust slowly, without haste, so that he felt every millimeter of the pain. He allowed himself to close his eyes for a moment, searching within himself for something he could hold on to, some hidden strength that would help him not collapse right there, in the middle of the street, like a specter of himself. Hours later, still not knowing exactly how he got home, he found the environment filled with a dense, almost palpable silence. The sofa, where he had so often fallen asleep with Isabel curled up next to him, now seemed cold and inhospitable. The kitchen carried the smell of forgotten dinners and bitter memories. Every object, every photograph on the walls, was a silent stab that forced him to face everything he had lost. With slow steps, like someone crossing a minefield, he climbed the stairs to his room. The place where so many dreams had been divided was now just a scene of abandonment and betrayal. Noah sat on the edge of the bed, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands hiding his face, and he stayed there, not crying, not screaming, just feeling his soul slowly fall apart. Dawn found him in that same position, motionless, like a statue of despondency. The insistent ringing of the cell phone on the dresser broke the torpor. He looked at the screen and saw Isabel's name flashing, a cruel irony that filled him with silent fury. He let the device ring until it went silent, refusing to hear any more excuses, more empty promises, more laments that no longer had the power to reach him. However, she insisted. Messages began to pop up, one after another, a string of anxious words begging for one last conversation, one last chance to explain everything, as if there was something that still needed to be said, as if betrayal was not in itself the end of all explanation. After 3 days of absolute silence, Noah decided he needed to end it permanently. Not for her, but for yourself. So he could finally leave the past behind and start building something new from the ashes. He arranged the meeting in a remote park, away from prying eyes, in an open space where words wouldn't echo off the walls of the house he could no longer call home. He arrived first, as he always arrived before in important meetings, but this time without the slightest trace of anxiety or hope. Just the raw need to face what was left. Isabel arrived a few minutes later, her face marked by tension, her eyes red from crying. She walked hesitantly towards Noah, who was waiting for her, arms crossed, his face closed like an insurmountable wall. She tried to smile, but the smile died on her lips when she met his gaze, so empty of everything that had warmed her before. He tried to speak, but the words caught themselves in his throat, and for a moment the only sound between them was the rustling of leaves danced by the cold wind. Noah remained motionless, waiting, offering no gesture of welcome, no spark of compassion. Finally, she began, her voice trembling, apologizing again, saying that she was sorry, that she had been weak, that she had never stopped loving him. He spoke about the loneliness he felt even though he was next to him, about the void he had tried to fill in the wrong way, about how, now, he understood that he had exchanged the real for a fleeting illusion. Noah listened to her without interrupting, without reacting, absorbing each word as if they were knives that he already knew could no longer hurt him. When she finally fell silent, awaiting a response, he took a deep breath, feeling the cold air fill his lungs like a blade, and responded with a calm that completely disarmed her. He said he understood her regret, but that some things, once broken, couldn't be fixed. He said that the love he had felt for her had been true and deep, but that what she had done went beyond any line he could forgive. He said he no longer held hate, because hate was a chain he refused to carry, but there was also no more room for it in his life. He said he wanted her to find peace, to find redemption, but away from him. Isabel tried to get closer, tried to touch her hand, but Noah retreated with an almost imperceptible, firm, non-negotiable movement. She cried, pleaded, asked if there was any chance, any remnant of feeling that could save them. Noah just shook his head, slow, heavy, as if carrying the weight of a definitive goodbye. And then, looking directly into her eyes, without any hesitation, he revealed that he had already found something new, something pure, something that, without even trying, had rekindled in him the hope that she had killed. Isabel turned pale, staggered back slightly, as if she had been hit with an invisible punch. He asked who it was, but Noah just smiled, a sad, resigned smile, and said it didn't matter. That what mattered was that now he knew that he was still worthy of love, worthy of respect, and that he no longer needed to beg for crumbs of affection from those who had not known how to value him. The impact was brutal. Isabel fell to her knees on the damp floor, her face contorted in pain, her hands clutching her chest as if she could stop her heart from shattering. Noah, for a moment, felt a distant echo of compassion, but then he remembered everything he had suffered, everything he had lost, and he knew that pity would be just a new prison. He turned without looking back, walking away from her, away from what was left of what they once were, away from the past that he could no longer carry. As he walked away, he felt the weight begin to lift, like mist rising at dawn. Every step was a silent affirmation that he had survived the worst. That, despite all the pain, I was still able to start over. She was still able to believe that, somewhere beyond the sadness, there was a future that didn't bear her name. And that future, finally, began to take shape. The way back seemed even longer than the way back, although Noah's steps were firm, filled with a decision that, although necessary, left a strange void inside him, like the echo of a trapped scream that would never be released. The image of Isabel kneeling, devastated by the pain she herself had caused, insisted on returning to her mind, mixing with the dull relief she felt at finally having put an end to that cycle of destruction. Every step he took was like letting go of an old weight, an invisible anchor that kept him tied to memories that no longer belonged to him. The rain, which still fell in thin silver threads, seemed to wash not only the ground beneath his feet, but also the last remnants of the man who had once blindly believed in forever. When he arrived home, the darkness he found no longer scared him. There was a kind of peace in the solitude that enveloped him, a bitter sense of newfound freedom. He settled down on the sofa, observing the environment as if analyzing the wreckage after a big storm, aware that the work of reconstruction would be arduous, but inevitable. He turned on the television just to hear some noise, so that the silence wouldn't be so absolute, and he stayed there, for hours, lost in thoughts that mixed between the past and what could be his future. The weeks that followed were marked by slow and painful reconstruction. Noah returned to frequent old places he previously avoided, reconnected with people he had involuntarily alienated while blindly dedicating himself to a love that he now knew had been one-sided for too long. With every step he took away from Isabel, he felt his identity recover in fragments. He began to smile more easily, to appreciate the warmth of an unpretentious conversation, the comfort of a sincere friendship, without hidden burdens. And, above all, he began to allow himself to dream again, even if timidly, even if he carried the scars created by everything he had experienced. However, the dilemma that slowly began to take shape in his mind was something that could not be ignored for long. The new relationship that had emerged, so naturally, carried within it a seed of something true, something that could, if nurtured, turn into the kind of love he thought was forever beyond his reach. But at the same time, there was fear. A deep, almost paralyzing fear of repeating old mistakes, of opening your heart again and finding, in the end, only more pain. Noah knew that, to move forward fully, he would need to face this fear, he would need to accept that loving again was, in itself, an act of courage, an inevitable risk. Between one afternoon and another, between shy smiles and glances exchanged with those who now occupied an increasingly larger space in his thoughts, Noah felt the weight of his own contradictions. It was as if he was torn between the desperate desire to dive back into what made him feel alive and the instinct of self-preservation that screamed at him to stay away, safe within the walls that, with so much effort, he had begun to build around himself. Every gesture, every word exchanged, every casual touch was accompanied by a flood of conflicting emotions that left him exhausted, as if he were waging a silent war inside his chest. The new woman, intuitive like few others, understood this conflict, although she never pressed it. There was a patience in his gestures, a silent understanding that, far from speeding Noah up, gave him the time and space he needed to, little by little, break down the barriers that separated him from the life he wanted to have again. And it was this absence of pressure, this respectful freedom, that little by little began to melt the ice around his heart. For the first time in a long time, Noah felt like maybe he didn't need to be perfect to be loved. That perhaps, with all its scars, it could still be seen, understood, welcomed. Meanwhile, Isabel continued trying to find ways to stay present, sending sporadic messages that ranged from bitter resignation to desperate attempts at reconciliation. Some nights, Noah would find himself staring at his cell phone screen, feeling a pang of pity, but he would quickly remember that the pity was a trap, a chain disguised as compassion that would tie him back to what he had already decided to leave behind. He knew he couldn't allow himself to look back, couldn't build his future on the rubble of the past. The moral dilemma before him was inevitable. Moving forward meant not only leaving Isabel in the past, but also forgiving himself for having failed to save her, for having believed for so long in something that, deep down, was already dead long before the final betrayal. It was a difficult weight to bear, to acknowledge that, on some level, he was also responsible for the rifts that had grown between them. Not because of her choice to cheat, that was a responsibility that fell solely on her, but because she blinded herself, because she ignored signs, because she believed that love, alone, would be enough to keep two people together. These thoughts accompanied him as he walked through the city streets, watching the hurried comings and goings of people, each carrying their own invisible pains, their own silent regrets. In the middle of the crowd, Noah felt strangely connected to everyone and no one at the same time, as if the pain made him more human, more real, more aware of the fragility of everything we try to build together. And it was this painful awareness that drove him forward, that gave him the strength not to give up, even when fear threatened to paralyze him. On one of those gray days, when the city seemed to perfectly reflect the turbid state of his soul, Noah met his new woman in a small corner restaurant. The welcoming and warm environment contrasted with the biting cold outside, and for the first time he felt that he had crossed, albeit staggeringly, an invisible line that separated the past from the present. They sat facing each other, with a glass of wine between them, and talked for hours about everything and nothing, sharing stories, laughing at silly things, creating, without realizing it, new memories that, this time, were devoid of the pain that had marked him so much. At one point, she touched her hand on the table, a simple gesture, but full of meaning. Noah looked down at that gentle touch, and then up at her eyes, which looked up at him with a mixture of patience and silent expectation. It was as if she said, without words, that she was there, ready to walk beside him, but that it was up to him to decide to take the next step. And, in that moment, Noah understood that the real dilemma wasn't about trusting again, but about allowing himself to be happy despite everything. With a still uncertain but sincere smile, he gently squeezed her hand, accepting without reservations what life, so unexpectedly, offered him. There, in that discreet touch, in that simple gesture, a new story began to be born. A story that, this time, would be built not on unrealistic expectations, not on the denial of pain, but on the complete acceptance of who he was and who he could become. And there was still a lot to be experienced. The days became weeks, and the weeks slowly began to weave a new time into Noah's life, a time that he didn't plan, that he didn't want, but that he now embraced with the resigned courage of someone who has already lost what they most feared losing. Little by little, the wounds opened by betrayal began to heal, not because they were forgotten, but because he learned to live with the marks he carried, like a silent map of everything he survived. The new relationship, built with the careful slowness of someone who has seen castles crumble before their eyes, began to take on deep roots. There was no rush, there were no demands, just two hurting hearts that, through different paths, had learned the value of patience, kindness and brutal honesty that only pain can teach. It was an autumn afternoon when Noah decided to change scenery, feeling that the house where he had experienced so much pain and memories could no longer be a true home for the new life he was trying to build. The idea of starting somewhere else, where every wall, every corner, wasn't permeated with ancient ghosts, seemed not just necessary but vital. So, without much ceremony, he placed his few most valuable belongings in boxes, left behind the heavy furniture that spoke of a past he refused to carry and moved to a small apartment in the center, where the tall windows let the sun invade the rooms and the nights were filled with the living sounds of the city that never slept. The change, although physical, had a symbolic weight that Noah felt in every gesture, in every object packed, in every silent farewell made to the places where he had loved, suffered, forgiven and been betrayed. In his new home, he found not only space for his books, for his music, for his solitude, but also space to rewrite his story, this time consciously, with choices made by himself and for himself, without the invisible shackles that previously tied him to other people's expectations. The nights, once so dreaded, were now opportunities for genuine introspection. Noah rediscovered the pleasure of walking aimlessly, of sitting in anonymous cafes, of watching people pass by and imagining their stories. It was as if the pain that had devastated him had opened a new perspective within him, more attentive, more human, more real. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to fill every void, to heal every wound immediately. He had learned to respect his own rhythms, to embrace his own imperfections. However, like everything that is truly human, life was not limited to a single linear movement of healing and ascension. There were days when the memory still hurt, when the memory of Isabel appeared like an unexpected thorn, piercing the newly won peace. It was not longing for what they had experienced, nor a desire to return, it was just the lingering shadow of something that was once too important to be erased easily. On those nights, Noah allowed himself to feel the pain, without drowning in it, recognizing it as part of who he was now, but not as defining what he would become. In the midst of this slow and silent reconstruction, the relationship with the new woman blossomed with a discreet beauty, like a flower that blooms in adversity. There was something deeply restorative about the way she looked at him, not with expectations of perfection but with an almost touching acceptance of his scars. They talked at length about everything and nothing, sharing fears, dreams, regrets and unlikely plans, and in this genuine sharing, Noah felt, little by little, whole again. Confidence, wounded so seriously before, began to germinate again, shy but alive, and it was this delicacy that moved him most, the fact that, even after everything, he was still capable of believing. On a particularly cold night, sitting on the sofa in the new apartment, she spoke, with an honesty that took him by storm, about her own pain, her own betrayals, her own losses. It was a moment of mutual vulnerability, in which two human beings, marked by the past, recognized in each other not only what was best about them, but also what was most human about them. Noah, touched by her courage to expose herself without a mask, felt something inside him give way, a last inner wall that, without realizing it, he still protected with distrust. He held her hand firmly and, with a choked voice, said that he was ready to try, not out of desperation, not out of need, but because he wanted to build something real, something that didn't need lies to exist. Meanwhile, somewhere not far away, Isabel was on her own lonely journey. The initial attempts to win him back had ended in silent humiliations, in ignored messages, in casual encounters in which she barely dared to lock eyes with Noah. She had learned, from others, that he was moving forward, that he seemed lighter, more serene, and this news, although inevitable, was like a knife slowly stabbing into his chest. Isabel now faced the weight of her choices, with no one to share it, and understood, too late, that some losses are definitive, and that love, once betrayed, does not always offer the chance of redemption. On another autumn afternoon, Noah walked with his new wife along the banks of the river that ran through the city, watching the golden leaves fall from the trees in a slow and inevitable dance. The cold wind brought with it the smell of wet earth and promises of a new cycle. They stopped in front of the water, and she, leaning her head on his shoulder, asked him softly if he thought time really healed all wounds. Noah smiled, a smile that carried within it all the pain, all the resilience and all the hope that now coexisted within him, and replied that time did not heal, but taught to live with the scars, transforming them into silent parts of one's own history. The moral dilemma that had haunted him so much, between the fear of loving again and the desire to live fully, now seemed to find its answer not in grand gestures or definitive words, but in the simple act of continuing to walk, day after day, choosing to trust despite the fear, choosing to love despite the scars. Noah knew there were no guarantees, that life, in its cruel unpredictability, could once again rip him off his axis at any moment. But he also knew that living in fear wasn't really living, it was just surviving, and he was tired of just surviving. So, on that cold shore illuminated by the soft light of evening, Noah made a silent and irrevocable decision. He would leave the past where it belonged, not because he wanted to forget it, but because he finally accepted that his life did not need to be defined by the pain he suffered, but by the choices he was still capable of making. And in that moment, intertwining his fingers with hers, he chose, without reservation, to walk forward, wherever the path led. The end hadn't come yet, but for the first time in a long time, Noah knew that, regardless of the setbacks that life could bring him, he had already won the most important battle, not letting pain define who he was. The days began to unfold with a lightness that Noah didn't remember experiencing in a long time, as if he had finally found a point of balance between who he had been, who he had become, and who he still wanted to be. The silent and constant presence of the woman at her side was like a daily reminder that, even after the most brutal devastation, it was possible to find beauty again, it was possible to smile without fear, it was possible to love without the desperate need to cancel yourself out. The modest apartment where he had chosen to start over now came to life, not just with the objects that slowly filled the space, but with the renewed energy of someone who had decided to live without carrying the rubble of other people's mistakes. He still had moments of doubt, brief flashes in which the fear of repetition appeared like an uncomfortable whisper, but now he knew how to face them, he knew how to silence them with the calm strength of someone who no longer defined himself by the wounds that had been imposed on him. While Noah flourished in his new reality, Isabel sank deeper into the loneliness she herself had woven. He tried to move forward impulsively, clinging to unfamiliar faces, trying to anesthetize the guilt and longing with empty and ephemeral relationships that, instead of filling the emptiness he felt, only revealed how much he had lost. With each new failed attempt, with each new look that did not carry even half the tenderness that she had once received from Noah, Isabel was confronted by the bitter reality that certain losses are irreversible, that certain mistakes do not offer the chance of a second correction. Little by little, friends moved away, the family looked on with eyes full of silent judgment and, before she realized it, she herself had already isolated herself, trapped in a world where her choices echoed like screams that no one else bothered to hear. There was an afternoon, many months later, when Isabel chanced upon him in a bookstore. She was haggard, the deep circles under her eyes betraying sleepless nights and a tiredness that seemed to be more of her soul than her body. Noah, on the other hand, was serene, with a slight smile on his lips as he leafed through some book. The shock of seeing him so well, so full, was like a silent blow that left her breathless. She hesitated, thought about approaching him, about apologizing once again, about begging for one last chance, but when she saw him smile at a woman who approached, the woman who now walked beside him naturally, as if she always belonged there, Isabel knew, with painful clarity, that her time was up, that there was no longer any room for her in this story. And, in silence, he turned and left, swallowing the bitter tears that fell without permission. Noah, unaware of her presence, continued his afternoon as if nothing had changed, because nothing had really changed. He had made his choice, and his choice was to live. When he left the bookstore hand in hand with his new partner, he felt a genuine feeling of gratitude for the life that, even after so much suffering, had given him a new chance. Not a second chance with the same person, but a new life built with maturity, respect and, above all, truth. Deciding to trust again had been the bravest gesture of his existence, and now he was reaping the fruits of that courage, living a story that, although imperfect like all human stories, was profoundly true. The former friend, the one who had been part of the cruelest scam in his life, had also paid his price. The rumor of betrayal had exploded like a bomb within the circle of friendships and professional relationships they both frequented. Slowly but inexorably, ostracism hit him with the force that shame always brings to those who betray not only others but also themselves. He lost the respect of his colleagues, saw doors close one by one, faced the loneliness of those who chose momentary pleasure in exchange for everything solid. He tried to rebuild his life in another city, trying to erase the marks of what he had done, but some scars are too deep to be hidden. Noah, in turn, did not harbor hatred, but he also did not feel compassion. Just the certainty that justice, in some silent and relentless way, had been done without him having to get his own hands dirty. The moral dilemma that had accompanied Noah since his betrayal now seemed as distant as a storm seen from the other side of the mountain. The fear of loving, trusting, giving oneself, had been overcome not by a definitive answer, but by the simple act of continuing to walk, even with the uncertainties, even with the scars. He had learned that living is, above all, an act of daily courage, and that true happiness does not come from the absence of pain, but from the ability to move forward despite it. He now found himself in a place of inner peace that he had never imagined possible when everything collapsed, and this peace was built, day after day, in small gestures, in deep conversations, in shared smiles, in hands that sought each other not out of necessity, but out of choice. Over time, Noah and his new partner decided to build a new home together, not as someone trying to erase the past, but as someone who understands that a true home is one where the heart can rest without fear. Every wall, every object, every space was filled not just with furniture, but with a silent promise of respect, love and loyalty. It was a house full of open windows, of natural light, of plants that grew freely, like discrete metaphors of what they allowed themselves to be, imperfect, but alive, deeply alive. And so it was that, at the end of a path marked by devastating losses, by betrayals that tore his soul apart, by dilemmas that challenged him to the limit, Noah found his redemption not in revenge, not in denial, but in the courage to live fully. Isabel, in turn, continued to bear the weight of her mistakes, condemned to be a spectator of the happiness that she herself destroyed. And the former friend, once so close, became just a bitter memory, lost in the folds of time, irrelevant in the face of the vibrant life that Noah chose to build. This is the story of a man who learned, the hard way, that true love begins within oneself and that, no matter how unpredictable and cruel life is at times, there will always be new roads for those who have the courage to keep walking, even when the path seems impossible. If you've made it this far, I want to know, what did you think of this story? Comment your opinion, share your feelings about everything these characters have experienced. Your participation is very important to us. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more intense stories like this. Remember, here we do not support, romanticize or encourage any type of betrayal. The mission of this channel is to show, through fiction, how wrong choices can destroy lives and teach the value of living with respect and truth. Until the next story.